What up, guys? Welcome to the Jiu-Jitsu podcast number 320. 320. You know what that means?
Yes.
Absolutely nothing. It's nothing. So it's just
Means
a
a
number.
lot.
It means a lot of podcasts, but it means absolutely nothing.
Yeah.
So today's podcast, we were talking about an idea. We saw something online, and then we were sort of talking about the idea of one piece of advice per belt level. And so, again, we all have different challenges in jiu-jitsu, but I was thinking about myself in mind with these. I'm going to give you the best piece of advice that I could give to myself at each belt level. Now, again, this may work very well for you, may not work well for you. I don't know. But I'm going to give you the advice I would give to myself if I was my own coach, or if I could go back and have a conversation with myself, because again, it's stuff that I think is super important at each level. And again, jiu-jitsu guys sometimes get a little too wrapped up in the belt. This is true. So if, let's say, if you train in a situation where there are no belts, just equate each one of these belts to maybe being a year and a half to 2 years of training, right? Like, they're kind of milestones, and that's somewhere in that neighborhood is what they represent, give or take. But again, that's the idea. So with that said, hopefully you guys enjoy this podcast and you're able to take something away from the piece of advice, no matter what rank you are in jiu-jitsu, or no matter how long you've been training. This stuff is all useful. And again, put it into practice. Big thanks to our sponsors for helping make this podcast happen. Charlotte's Web CBD. If you guys have never checked them out, you can check them out at charlottesweb.com. There is a code for 30% off using the promo code Chewjitsu30 for 30% off. And right now, they just came out with a stay asleep gummy, which uses the CBN cannabinoid. I'm in the process of trying it out. I want to try it out for a couple weeks and see what I notice. See if it makes me groggy, see if it helps me sleep a little longer, that kind of thing. I've taken it a couple nights, but again, I don't want to, just because I had a good night's sleep one night doesn't necessarily mean it's a gummy. So I'm going to test it out for a little bit, because typically through the week, no matter what I do, I usually always have at least 1 or 2 nights that are kind of off, or maybe like I wake up a little bit in the middle of the night. So I want to test it out and see if I notice a difference there. But I'll let you guys know how it goes. But again, I've used a lot of their products, and they're great products, whether you're looking for balms for a sore muscle, or after training, or if you want something to help deal with, just overall sports induced inflammation that comes from tugging on joints, just like with what we do. So you can check them out at charlottesweb.com, and the promo code is Jiu-Jitsu30 for 30% off the order. Also, if you guys want to check out some great jiu-jitsu gear and apparel, check out epicrollbjj.com is the website, epicrollbjj.com. Our buddy Matt runs the website. I get my rash guards and rash guard and shorts made through Matt because I like the designs, and the rash guard quality is pretty solid. I get my gym stuff made through him too, just because I like the quality of it, and he does a good job of customer service as well. So if you get on his website and you look through and find anything that you like, you can use the promo code Jiu-Jitsu20 for 20% off the order. Also, sort of on a side tangent, coming up probably in the next 30 days or so, somewhere in that range, we'll be having a new Jiu-Jitsu rash guard out for grabs, and we'll have some ranked versions. And so more details on that to come, but just keep your eyes out. And if you guys are on my email list, you will get first crack at that when they go on sale. If you want to support the podcast directly, you can do so by going to our Patreon at patreon.com/the Jiu-Jitsu podcast. When you become a patron to the Jiu-Jitsu podcast, you'll get access to an exclusive library of content that we've produced. And again, you get a lot of extra bonuses and stuff like that. You can look on the website to check it out. But along with that, you're supporting the podcast that you listen to every single week. I mean, thousands of you guys do. So if you want to support the podcast and get some added bonuses, check out patreon.com/the Jiu-Jitsu podcast. And last but not least, guys, if you'd like to get my daily email where I send out everything from training ideas, diets, strength training, snippets from books that I'm reading. Last week, I think I sent one about Theodore Roosevelt and Booker T. Washington. A lot of you guys seem to like that one. A little bit of a history thrown in there. It seems to strike a chord with many of you, so that's cool. Bunch of history geeks in there as well. But again, all sorts of stuff that, again, is sometimes very much jiu-jitsu related and sometimes very not jiu-jitsu related, but nonetheless, all there to help give you an idea to chew on, give you something to consider, and get you to think about something maybe a little differently. You can get access to it at jiu-jitsu.net/join. When you join up, you'll get my daily email. You'll get some gifts that I give away for free, including a couple ebooks and videos. And then on top of that, I give the email first grabs on all my camps and events that I have. They get special offers that are not available anywhere else. So you get all that and more at jiu-jitsu.net/join. So guys, with that said, let's jump into this podcast. So again, we're going to start with the belts and then one piece of advice, then we'll wrap about that piece of advice and then go from there. So white belt, right? If I, this isn't really a piece of advice I needed help with, but it's something I think a lot of people do. And it would be like, if I was having a conversation with myself as a white belt, I didn't need to tell myself that. But it's something that I think is just, everybody has to hear this no matter what, because it is what it is. So anyway, that piece of advice as a white belt is nothing new. It's nothing you've never heard before, but it's so critically important. We'll talk about why, but just show up. You have to show up. There's no way around it. No amount of technical hacks or tweaks or adjustments can supersede your need to be consistent, and you have to show up consistently. That's what has to happen. There's no ifs, ands, or buts about it. You can't get good at jiu-jitsu going every few weeks or something. You have to be there consistently. It's an investment of time, and it just is what it is, right? Which is, again, is why it's very important that when you get into it, one of the most important things I think to make that show up part happen is really getting clear about what it is that you enjoy about this. Because if you're going into a place, you just think about this for a second. Like, let's say if you think about the average jiu-jitsu practitioner, we're talking 24 to probably in their late 30s, that sort of time frame, right? There's obviously younger, there's older, but that's kind of like most jiu-jitsu gyms are filled with people in that age range, right? Well, you're taking time away from potential work, your family, all sorts of different things, right? Other hobbies and everything else. You got to know why the hell you're doing this, right? And these are questions that you have to ask yourself. This is something I think people don't do enough of this just in general with life. They don't sit back and, basically perform an exercise where they ask themselves, why am I doing this? And why do I want to do this? And why will I continue to do this? And what makes this enjoyable? You think about, for instance, like if you're going to buy something, let's say you're going to buy a car. And you're going to get financing for it instead of, let's say paying it cash, or even if you pay cash, you think about how much money that's going to cost you every month. And then you can sit back and say, well, how many hours of time in my life is this going to require? Am I okay with working X amount of hours of my life, or working X amount of days or whatever to fuel this thing? Because, maybe you need to think about that. This is a thing where you think about people have different problems in different situations. But again, you have to ask yourself these questions, and in my opinion, with just about everything, and you should, so that you understand why you're doing the things that you're doing, opposed to just sort of haphazardly letting your life happen. You should be very intentional about it with everything. So with that said, you need to get very clear with why you're training and why you enjoy this, because if you know why you enjoy this, even if you're having a bad day, even if it didn't go as well as you'd like, even if you're feeling a little frustrated, you'll feel okay because of the fact that you know that you enjoy this because of X, Y, or Z. And that was one of the reasons why I didn't need this advice, but it still would have been confirmation for me back then, because I got very frustrated sometimes. And looking back at it, I could have just told myself, hey, listen, just keep showing up. It's going to get better. You'll have more time. Just keep going.
Yeah, I agree. Like the consistency, you can't get better at anything without it. Number one. But number two, I think it's a question that I've asked myself, like as I've even gone through the belt ranks, like what's my why? Like, why am I doing this thing? And that may evolve and change, but it's good to kind of have some clarity over that, at white belt and even beyond. And then like some other things I was just thinking about, consistency can happen even if you can't train. Like if you're injured, for example, I think it's still important to have your finger on the pulse, maybe show up to class, watch technique, have battle buddies that can help consistency. If you have somebody that you kind of like, me and Adam started training together. So him going to jiu-jitsu, I was like, man, I don't want him to get way better than me. So I'm going to keep showing up too. So having somebody that holds you accountable, that can help with consistency. Just there's a lot of things that, it's not, you got to show up. You got to obviously be an active participant and pay attention and things like that. And injuries happen. From my side, I see a lot of people kind of fall off, whether life gets in the way or injuries get in the way. But if you can still some way keep your finger on the pulse, keep a connection to the gym and your training partners and even your coaches, I think it can really help you keep that consistency going.
Yeah, sure. If you get injured or something, right? Or if you're
Yeah.
not as consistent. But again, I think at the end of the day, you still have to continuously show up.
Yeah.
You're going to get injured and those are going to happen. So you just do what you can and you keep
Yep.
going.
Yep.
Obviously, as we go through one piece of advice, we're gonna brush over a lot of stuff.
Mm-hmm.
But again, that just it has to be the first thing. And you think about this too. A lot of times I think people get really, really interested and fascinated by like the small stuff that moves the needle very little. So for instance, they'll look at someone saying, "Oh man, this person's doing a ice bath, or they're doing cupping for recovery, or they take this supplement, or they've got this really cool training mask, or whatever gadget or tweak or shortcut you wish to use." And with that, people tend to brush over the thing that sort of creates like the 80-20 rule, like the small things that really push 80% of what's really going on, and which is a lot of times boring stuff that everyone knows how to do but they don't want to do it. It's like losing weight. It's really not that hard and everybody can do it. It really comes down to I mean, again, I know someone might struggle with it. I'm not saying it's not easy, because sometimes the simplest things aren't easy, right? They're very difficult, but it's not complicated, right? Like you stop eating no fast food, no sugary drinks, just water, get exercise in. If you're not losing weight, eat less food. I mean, it's really just that simple, and there's no way around it. No matter what some influencer tells you online, it's that simple. So again, that doesn't mean that it's easy, and a lot of times that's the thing, right? Like we look for these little tweaks and these little things, but usually when you look at the best people in jiu-jitsu and you look at anybody that's accomplished anything, a lot of time it really, the big mover is the consistency and strong habits, right? They're just consistent. They have strong habits. They continuously work. They're always doing their thing. And that's the big mover. Like that's what really moves everything. And so if you start early and you have this consistent habit, this consistency, then you're just going to have that momentum behind you. And it's easier to continuously stay with jiu-jitsu and not fall off the track.
I got you. Yep. All right, Chewy, blue belt. What we got?
So many people have listened to my videos where I've talked about the idea that the blue belt is the buffet belt, right? Where you are experimenting and playing. Because, when you're thinking about, let's say, blue belt or a couple of years into training, you're now at this point where you're not getting smashed by everybody, right? I've used the analogy that it's almost like you're drowning, and then at blue belt, you're finally able to climb up on top of something, like maybe a small boat or a raft or something, and you now have the ability to steer things around a little bit. You're still in this big, vast ocean, and you're still very overwhelmed, but at the same time, you have some control. Well, the big thing that I would tell people to do with this belt is start to use one of the most powerful training techniques that you can employ. It's something that literally every very skilled, highly skilled jiu-jitsu practitioner I've ever talked to does this. This was one of the ways that I was able to, as a black belt, go compete successfully at black belt competitions when really I only had white and blue belt training partners, which is you have to learn how to play. And by play, I mean you have to learn how to experiment, and you have to learn how to like sort of try new things and not be so worried about the outcome, right? Because again, what ends up happening a lot of times is when people start to get a little bit of control, they tend to like to stroke their ego, go in and smash everybody and then walk out like I won all the rounds. That's great. You won all the rounds. Did you get better at anything? Maybe, maybe not. You don't know. But if you go into the round and you're specifically working on something, then that's what's really important. And by play, what I'm saying is that you're learning how to just do it and not take it so seriously, because that's the issue, right? A lot of times we get into something And we take things so seriously with like our Western mind, which, you know, has its benefits, has its um, bad sides too. But you really have a hard time learning anything and exploring new stuff when you're not in that way of thinking. You know, you look at a child when they learn, they're just playing with stuff, and they learn very rapidly. And when you can learn how to play jujitsu rather than like trying to win jujitsu all the time, it puts you in such a more resourceful state of mind where you can rapidly learn things faster, and you're not so affected by when you don't have a good round or when you don't have a good day or whatever. It doesn't bother you so much. And so when you're now at this stage of blue belt where you can play with techniques, you have some control, you have these white belts below you that, you know, some of them are still very tough to you, but many of them you can control very easily. Well, those are the people where if you're trying to work on a new technique or you're trying to develop a weak side of your game or whatever it might be, those are your people to go work on. You know, and again, we've talked about as an example, Bernardo Faria was on the podcast years ago, and one of the ways that he said that he got really good with everything that he's used is that when he would go into the gym, you know, he's a heavyweight and super heavyweight world champion. He's a big man. Well, no one on the mat is just going to be able to really give him too much trouble tit for tat if he starts going competition mode, right? I mean, there's probably a couple, but not too many. So what does he do instead? He goes in and he rolls specifically with an intention of what he wants
Right.
to do in the roll. So he's rolling like he said, he was developing his omoplata. All he would do is basically roll with every person, and the only thing he allowed himself to do was omoplata. When he was working on his deep half guard game, it was the same thing. And so that's something you want to keep in mind when you get to blue belt and you can do some stuff and you're not getting smashed by everybody. Don't use it as just a chance to beat up all the weaker people and stroke your ego. Use it as a chance that when you roll with those people, use them as a chance to actively get reps in, and essentially you would be distorting the role, so to speak, to become almost like a situational role where you can use them to develop any position or technique that you want to. And again, this is something I used to do as a black belt with my blue belt and white belt training partners so that I could get better at techniques. And essentially, I'm getting active drilling repetitions. You know, this is essentially what it is through situational rolling. And then when I went into go against black belts, even though I wasn't getting that hard push from all the other black belts in my gym, I was still had a very, very fine-tuned game that was ready to be used.
Yeah, it's amazing to get that blue belt and not be in survival mode finally. Like you're kind of once you get that blue belt, you're kind of like, okay, I can kind of explore a little bit, play around a little bit, and but there's that balance or that fight of like I have a blue belt to represent, you know, I can't be getting submitted by white belts, and I have a bigger target on my back. So I think you see a lot of blue belts, and myself when I was a blue belt struggle with this because you feel like now you have like this rank and you have to protect that rank or feel like you're worth that blue belt. And so I think sometimes it's hard to just let yourself kind of do things you're not as good at because you've been getting your ass kicked or been on the worst end of most of the grappling exchanges for a while. And so once you get a little taste of like, oh, I can actually win a few rounds, you kind of want to do that. But be mindful that can be detrimental to your progress. So, but it's just one of those things you got to weigh.
Well, and again, it goes back to taking it too damn seriously, right? Like, what does it matter? You know, what does it matter if you lose this round or not? Something, and the reason why I said that you got to learn to play, this is one of the biggest, like if I could go back, this was one of my biggest struggles when I was in jiu-jitsu because I was trying to win every round. And eventually that created a lot of stagnation in my game. And when I eventually learned how to play jiu-jitsu and learned how to expose myself and, you know, go back into situations, which in some cases would put me back into survival mode, just like when I was a white belt, because I'm playing with movements and techniques that I'm not very good with.
Yeah.
What I found is I got better faster. So yes, maybe you have a little bit of discomfort on one end because you're getting beaten by someone or submitted by someone that you could technically beat. Sure, there's that. But at the same time, on the other end, you get better faster in a lot of cases, especially if you have intentional focus when you're training.
Yeah.
This is, again, I talk about this numerous times. You have to pay for all this stuff with discomfort and failure. That's what you pay for it with, right? Like you don't get to go through this and never fail and never have uncomfortable situations. You're not unique. We all have to do this. Even the best people in the world had to pay for their success now with a lot of discomfort and a lot of failures. Because again, failures are the currency that you pay for your future success with. That's the way that it works. And so better to do those failures as early as possible and start that process off now so you can start basically racking up a good amount of savings that you can spend when you're ready.
Right.
And so again, for anybody that's struggling with that feeling of, man, I don't want to look bad in front of my coach, or because I just answered a question about this the other day on the YouTube. People were saying like, oh, one guy was saying he wants to experiment, but he doesn't want to look bad in front of his coach. And the thing is, again, even if I doubt coaches care anyway, most of the time, but even if you look bad in front of your coach for a roll or two, what you'll find is you get better faster and you'll look better in front of your coach later on. So again, that would be my encouragement to you. This is something that I wish I would have understood sooner in my jiu-jitsu, because this is not something I really grasped until like the start of my, like my brown belt and later on.
I agree. All right, Chew, purple belt.
So purple belt, as I've mentioned on the podcast before, I consider it like the prototype, right? It's where you start to see certain areas of your game emerge. So if you think about it, most of us have we're more highly competent in certain areas, and we have some specialization in certain areas, right? We're not great everywhere. Even the best grapplers, they have a style. They have a few positions that they're very good from, and then other ones that they're not as good from. Everyone's this way. At purple belt, I think it's about that time where it starts to naturally happen, where you'll see people naturally begin to find this area of their game that they begin to specialize in. And you can think of it very naturally where your blue belt, you're playing around with a lot of stuff. You have some freedom to do that. It's like a teenager who has the keys to the car finally, and they can go off and explore the city on their own. Well, a teenager's probably going to find the places that they like visiting the most, right? Maybe they like a particular restaurant, or maybe they like a particular store. They're going to frequent those places more. Well, likewise, as you train, you'll start to find that there's certain techniques and areas that you just like. They just feel right to you. They feel good. Whether you went to them intentionally or they just haphazardly happened and you stumbled onto them one day and you said, man, that feels really good. I want to keep using this technique. So at the purple belt, I tend to tell people to start to specialize in an area. Find an area that you can develop that becomes yours, that becomes your go-to. Because when I look at the purple belts and I think about all the best purple belts that I've ever come across and had, they had these areas of their game that were almost black belt level, maybe even black belt level, but then they would be maybe rough around other areas of their game. They'd be rough around the edges. And so, guys, I was just thinking about this when we're talking about belts and all this stuff. I'm talking about sort of your average person in jiu-jitsu. I'm not really talking about the exceptions, because obviously there are plenty of really high level, purple belts and stuff like that will compete and win against black belts, right? This happens. And so I'm not really talking about them, because competition it's kind of a different monster altogether. And in competition, you're really not talking about who the absolute best is at, say, knowledge and overall. It's basically who can win this game, and athleticism plays into that. There's a lot of factors. So keep that in mind. We're talking about just your average jiu-jitsu practitioner, that sort of thing. So going to it, purple belt is a time to specialize in an area and develop that game. And that game typically becomes the prototype for what your game is going to kind of look like later on. Looking back at my purple belt days as a grappler back in like 2006 to 2008 was when I was a purple belt. I remember, if I look back on it, like my game was very similar in a lot of ways. I played Kimuras. I like to take the back and go for chokes. Was heavy on guard passing, had a little bit of butterfly guard sweep and half guard sweeps. I do all that same stuff now, just the game is much more expanded. And maybe you could think of it as like a small child versus, maybe a teenager or an adult. A lot of times you start to see certain traits that show themselves as a young child, that then as this child grows, they expand, right? They begin to grow, and you're like, you could kind of see how this child got from here to here. And so a lot of times at purple belt, as I said, I think it happens naturally, but it's something you want to take a sort of a conscious decision towards and dial in on a specific area of your game and really sharpen it, so that this way, when you go to a competition, when you're up against a tough person, you now have this offensive weapon to your game that, again, is going to carry you through into your black belt.
Yeah, a couple points I was just thinking. It's interesting how these specializations kind of come about, because sometimes they're just completely by accident. Sometimes it's something that you learn in class. Sometimes you stumble upon it. So interesting to see how it happens. And then the other thing is, like, as we're talking through these like belt ranks, each like piece of advice is predicated on the previous piece. You can't have one, like, you can't, without consistency, there's no exploration. Without exploration, there's no finding your specialization, right? So like all these things, like it's almost like you have to have A before B before C kind of thing, which is, it's kind of like a broader aspect. Like the first rule applies to everyone or at white belt, then a smaller subset as you get kind of up there. So it's just kind of interesting to think about that thing. And I feel like when you talk about purple belt, when we've talked about it, we could probably like have like a silhouette of an individual at the gym, and you can kind of like, without seeing what like their face or anything, you can kind of notice or kind of start to guess what who that is based on their movement patterns and kind of how they play jiu-jitsu. All right, Chew. Let's talk about brown belt.
So if we think of this early prototype of your purple belt phase, where you've dialed in, you found some area of your game that you specialized in, you start to get into a situation where obviously now you have a really very highly detailed area of your game, but then a lot of it's going to be rough around the edges, like any prototype, right? Like you have the thing that you wanted to deliver, right, with the prototype, but then there's a lot of things that you have to fine tune and fix. The prototype was the test. So as a test, you found your area of your game that's good. That's your test. It's working. Great. Fantastic. Well, now we got to go back around and we got to polish out. And so, get everybody's ideas of what brown belt and black belt and all that stuff is a little different. There's not just there's not one code that we all follow. I'm just giving you some general ideas that I think could be useful to you, that would have been useful to me, but that could be useful to you no matter the gym that you train at. But again, the brown belt is where you start to round things out. You start to polish it. And so for that, I would tell people, again, if you're a brown belt, then like now we're starting to, round things out. Find the areas of your game that maybe need a little bit more polishing and give them some attention. Because again, as brown belts, you can use the idea of playing jiu-jitsu and testing things out and experimenting very easily, because you now have an even greater number of people that you can play with very easily without having to be in a bad spot. And again, my brown belt phase, I had to do some really hard rounding out, because many of you guys know the story. When I was a purple belt, my coaches came to me and they said, listen, man, like, you've got to do different stuff with your game. Because, I kind of went the other route where I developed a really highly specialized game very early. And that was all I did. That's it. I was doing the same stuff over and over again. This created a lot of problems at purple belt and other belts where I was so specialized so early that I hadn't experimented. And so if you took me out of my little specialized area, like, I was done. I was cooked against good people. And so it was a problem. And so as a brown belt, especially, like, I had this already specialized game. Now I'm rounding things out a little bit, and I'm having to develop a lot of areas of my game that I hadn't developed for years. But again, with that rounding out process, mine took a little bit longer than most people's. But nonetheless, again, you're now rounding out the areas of your game that could be useful. One of the things that I would encourage brown belts to do, if you can get a chance, is to start teaching. Honestly, if you can start teaching earlier, the sooner the better. Teaching makes you think about jiu-jitsu in a different way. Now, no, not everybody wants to teach, and that's perfectly fine. But even as an assistant role, learning how to teach jiu-jitsu and helping people out, you have to think about jiu-jitsu very differently, and you learn from teaching to a greater degree.
Yep.
And so I think that when you start teaching, it really helps out your game. It really helps out your jiu-jitsu, and it can help you start to create a little bit more polish to your game, because now you're taking a very active approach to helping others people. And then it allows you to do the same to your game, because as you learn how to teach other people, you can very much teach yourself in the moments of your training. So again, it's brown belt, it's time to round out those areas. You got your area that's really good. Doesn't mean we have to disregard it completely, but let's round things out to make sure that you are ready for that next stage of black belt.
Do you think brown belts come to that conclusion on their own? Obviously, you had a little help from your coaches. Do you think a lot of people find that, hey, I'm not good at this stuff? Or does it take a little bit of getting exposed maybe at a tournament, or having your coach kind of address it with you? Like, what do you think that is? I think it can go both ways, obviously,
Yes.
but man, I'm good at winning. I'm winning tournaments at purple, this and that. Like,
The answer
and then
to all your
brown belt.
questions is yes.
Yeah.
Because I
Okay.
mean, some people do come to it naturally, right? But a lot of people don't. A lot of people have to be told from their coach, "Hey, man, like let's dial it into this area. Let's change things up a little bit." Or maybe you're getting crushed at a tournament and you have to develop the game because you feel the sting of losing. So
Mhm.
again, everybody has different challenges. We
And
had a story. We had Jeff on just a few months ago,
yeah.
and we were talking about that where Jeff was a really tough brown belt in the gym. And I remember having if you want to consider it that, a brown belt to black belt test. And I was having all of our brown belts roll with each other. And I was putting them in very specific situations that were tailored to their games so that I could see how they reacted. And with his game in particular, he had a great top game. But his bottom game was just non-existent in comparison. And so I told him, I was like, "Look, you need to work on your bottom game." I was like, "You have to do that." We did a few private lessons together. And then within a year, I mean, almost a year to the date, he sent me a message one day where he was at a competition pulling guard, putting people into leg locks. And again, this is something that would just be completely antithetical to his game a year prior. And so again, it's something where I had to tell him, just like I had to tell my coaches. Now, some people aren't so bullheaded as us, and they sort of pick it up on their own. But nonetheless, I think it's important, at least for the way that I think about black belt. Because when you get to black belt, as we'll talk about in a second, I mean, like you're just there.
Mhm.
You know what I mean? So we kind of want to make sure that we've got a decent game together when we get up there, and so we don't want to have too many holes. It's like if you're getting ready, if you think about as a purple belt, you're the prototype. Let's say if you're launching a product, right? Well, our prototype is like the early concept. We got this thing, we tested it out. Okay, it's a viable thing. Well, when we get ready to launch this thing, we need to get rid of all the holes and all the problems that exist
Yep.
with it so that we don't have a bunch of people wanting to like scrap this thing and return it, right? So what do? You say, okay, we need to like find the issues, find the holes, and let's plug those up and get this thing together so it's a nice, fully polished, packaged product.
Yeah.
So that's what I think about as brown belt. And so again, anybody that's at that stage, I would tell you again, it's time to round things out a little bit. So if there's areas of your game that you really feel like you lack, then it's a good time to get that taken care of, or at least start the process off now.
I think the one thing about you and Jeff is you guys, with having like a certain type of game you played. I believe that Jeff really got into MMA first before even jiu-jitsu,
Mhm,
and that maybe really like because you don't really want to be on bottom on your back in an MMA fight. So I think
mhm.
that's ingrained in your mind, when you start grappling, that you're going to continue. That's going to be your kind of default.
Yeah.
And once you start playing jujitsu, it's more of I mean, obviously you're not getting punched in the head or anything like that. When you're doing jujitsu as like purely for sport and competition and stuff, like that's a very acceptable and actually a good position. And Jeff is a hell of a leg locker now. And like, that's pretty much all he does is
Mhm,
he butt scoots and sits down. That's all. And he's fantastic at it. And I've learned so much from him even, because that's a part of my game that I kind of neglected because I just wanted to avoid it for a while. And
mhm.
eventually it's unavoidable when you get caught enough times. You're like, okay, I got to learn this thing. And so whether it's through competition, whether sometimes lower belts catching you and stuff, there's certain things that will wake you up to it. And I think competing at every belt level is such an advantage, like to your progression and your growth in jujitsu. I
Mhm.
think it gives you very, very powerful information and gives you good direction, or you can take direction from it. I mean, I think, and for me, it was very helpful at every belt rank I competed, and I found I didn't compete a ton, but at least a couple of times, and just to learn like where I'm lacking and what I need to work on.
Yeah, I mean,
Um,
anytime you compete, you're going to get that good feedback from
I just think, yeah,
what's going on with your game. I mean, that's a great thing to do. Just in general. I mean, competing, you don't have to compete, obviously, but competing does give you an insight into your game that's really hard to replicate in any other way, because you're not going to get the same kind of feel of when you are testing your game at 100% to see what it's made of, and you're going against someone who doesn't know your game, who doesn't care about you, and they're trying to come at you 100%, and then you see what breaks and then what works. And it can be a very useful tip. I mean, again, if you can't compete because of health reasons or something, that's fine. But if you have the ability to compete, it can be a worthwhile thing. So,
And just one more point, if you can't compete, I think going to open mats is also just kind of, it's not, obviously the intensity is not going to be, or should not be as intense as a, a tournament. However, that's also a great way to get exposure to different, belt ranks and different individuals and people that aren't used to your style. All right, Chewy. So what's the idea of black belt?
So with black belt, I've used a quote numerous times because it's one of those things where I think of jiu-jitsu as an art. You can compare it to, like, say, music or jazz music, where improvisation is huge, things like that. And there's a quote from Charlie Parker that I really like, where he says, master your instrument, master the music, and then forget all that bullshit and just play. And I think that's kind of what happens at black belt, sort of naturally, but it's something that, kind of just, it's going to happen at that point, right? Where I know we're kind of coming back into, like, learning how to play, that kind of thing, but you just forget all the rules. Like, stop. You don't worry about belts anymore. You're not trying to win all the time. You're just like, whatever, we're just playing jiu-jitsu. And it also allows you to, and again, black belt / you now have jiu-jitsu in a different place inside of your nervous system. This is really hard to explain, but essentially, when you've been training for long enough, or if you've put in enough time on the mat, you will do jiu-jitsu as it requires about as much effort as, like, a jog. Like, you're just moving. Like, you're not even thinking about it. Like, I mean, I can, unless I'm up against a really, really tough opponent, I can just go through jiu-jitsu and just, my brain can almost be turned off, and I'm not even thinking. Everything's autopilot, right? I really have to be more thoughtful before my brain even turns on to be focused, right? Because I've done it so long. I've literally just, like, I can fight grips with people, and my hands are just doing what they're supposed to do. I'm not even thinking about it. It's such an interesting thing, because it's like walking. You don't have to think about walking. Now, you can actively think about putting your foot in one in front of the other, but otherwise you'll just walk. You can breathe naturally, or if I'm telling you right now, you're listening, you now have become conscious of your breathing. So now you're having to think about breathing, but as soon as you forget, you're going to go back to breathing like normal. Well, jiu-jitsu becomes like that eventually, where you're doing so many things that used to be, like, for instance, grip fighting used to take up, like, all my consciousness to do it properly. Now it takes up, like, it's just back there on autopilot, and then I can think. When you're at that stage of jiu-jitsu, the whole damn thing changes. And you're now able to play in a higher level, and you can break rules. You can do things the wrong way, and they somehow still work. And you can play around in a way that you just couldn't do before. You just couldn't, because you did not have the skill and the competency that you do now. And so, again, when you get to that stage, whether that's black belt, brown belt, or whatever it might be, you just forget all the rules. Just go. You're now at the belt that you're pretty much always going to be at, right? You'll get some stripes, maybe you get a coral belt, but none of it really matters. You got black belt, you're there. You'll be up against people that got their belt, a month ago, a year ago. Sometimes they got their belt 20, 25 years ago. Like, there's a guy I met one time who he got his black belt when I started training. You know what I mean? So, I mean, 20 years ago or something. It's crazy. So, again, you're in this place with just, this is where you're at. And so you don't really worry about anything. And then again, with the higher level of skill, what you find is that you start to be able to tweak things. And this is something that's interesting in jiu-jitsu, where what you'll find is that early on, jiu-jitsu practitioners do a good job of, essentially, think of this, there's like a technique thing that happens where, if someone teaches a technique, initially there's a lot of variation amongst people, because people are, like, doing it differently because they're not very good at it, right? They're trying to mimic what their coach showed them. And then there's a lot of variation as they're trying to put together. Then you have a bit of standardization where everybody's kind of on the same page, doing it the right way, or doing it the way that was shown to them. Well, at the later stages, when they've really developed some skill, variation emerges again, because when you start to embody the rules and the movements of jiu-jitsu on a level that you don't even have to think about it, you then start doing things and you don't know why you're doing them, but all of a sudden you start figuring things out. Right? It just happens like this. And again, this happens, you'll have moments of this early on, but it's on a different scale and far more common when you're at a higher level of skill later on in jiu-jitsu. And so at that stage, like I said, it's kind of like that quote from Charlie Parker, just forget all the rules. Forget all the rules, and now we're just doing jiu-jitsu.
Yeah, I think because you're more efficient, your jiu-jitsu requires less bandwidth. You can see more, like you can almost like it's kind of like the Matrix, you kind of slow down time in some ways. You can see openings. It's kind of like you remember Neo was like, I know kung fu. It's kind of like
no.
you're like, I know jiu-jitsu.
Oh no!
You
I mean,
just
to
kind of
be a
see
good
stuff,
athlete,
right?
to be a good athlete in any sport, you'll have to experience this slowing of time. Like when
Yeah.
you think of like a quarterback who has maybe 3 to 5 seconds of coverage. For him, 3 to 5 seconds is an eternity, right?
Yes.
In that moment, I remember talking to a guy that rode horses. In a horse race is like around 2 minutes, and he was telling me that there are all these points of decisions that he has to make, like 20 plus decisions being made in this 2-minute race. And any of these decisions because when you think about the difference between, say first place and winning money and then like whatever, not winning money, like
Right.
it's like fractions of a second. So if you don't make the right choice in one of these points of decisions, it can be really dangerous, but it can also cost you. Or even if you hesitate for a moment, right? So yeah, you're 100% right about that. When you're very high level, or if you've gained a high level of skill, it all slows down to a great degree.
Yeah, there's a sense of like I don't want to say you've mastered jujitsu, but like there's a sense of mastery and a sense of flow. And I think for me, I read that book, Flow. I believe one of the elements of flow was like time
It's
changes. Like,
distorts.
yeah, it almost is like it's like things may go really fast, but in your mind they're going slowly, kind of thing. It's like you see them, it's like you see openings. So it's interesting, and you can, and as you get more experienced, obviously at black belt, like it's just those things at black belt, those openings become more evident, more clear, more of the time. Essentially, where you might get glimpses of it at brown belt, maybe even purple belt, but like you get more of into that flow state, I think, at black belt. And
I mean, you'll have glimpses of these all throughout your game.
sure.
I think it's one of those things where at a certain point it just becomes the norm. You know what I mean? Like, whereas before it was like you would get into the state and you're like, whoa, like that was cool.
Yeah.
Whereas as a black belt, I mean, if you know how to do it, right? Like you can put yourself in that state pretty quickly. Like for me, like I can easily get myself into a state of a flow. If I am in control of everything. This is one of the reasons why I like, again, being in control of my gym and in the environment, because you can facilitate that process if you know how to do it. You can train yourself to do it. And so you start seeing this pop up where, like you said, time slows down and you're thinking on a different level because all the basic stuff that you've spent years mastering and learning is on autopilot now. And now you're able to think on a different level. And in some cases, you're thinking about why you do things after the fact, because you do something because it just feels right. And then you have to kind of look backwards and say, why does that work? I mean, this is how jiu-jitsu worked for a lot of us, where we would do things because they worked. We didn't really know why they worked. And then we would have to come backwards and go, okay, why did that work? Because that was really cool. And I've been hitting this on everybody.
Right.
Your
Reverse
body
engineer
just,
it. Right.
yeah, because your body just, you've become jiu-jitsu, right? Your body has literally like become this thing. You're because you think about what happens, and this as a physical therapist. Obviously, you have these neuromuscular connections being like hardwired into your body, right? But you even think about the physical adaptations of our body, right? You could even consider them deformities in some cases, right? Where our body begins to change, to adapt, to become more efficient for the thing that we're doing on a consistent basis, right? Certain muscles begin to get tighter or shorter. Certain muscles become stronger, right? Our ears begin to puff up, and certain, like our abdominal muscles sometimes get kind of blocky from so much torque. Opposed to, this is like, you look at like some of the old statues, you'd see like these blocky wrestler statues opposed to the traditional V taper. And so again, with that said, when you get into these situations, your body is becoming jiu-jitsu. it's adapting to this thing, and it's wiring itself to do that thing. The body's amazing. And so once your body has been essentially like wired and adapted to do this sport, it's a different world, right?
Mhm.
This is where, like, if I watch competition sometimes, when I'm in that state, I'm like watching myself, and there's times where I'm doing stuff I've never done in training. My body's improvising very much, like, again, like I like that idea of the jazz musician. They're just playing music, and they're not necessarily doing it because they know, they're not thinking about it intentionally, right? They're just doing it because they spent years playing these different chord progressions or learning these different situations with their instrument, and then eventually the body's just taking over based upon feel. This is why sometimes I'll see these videos where people will do like narration breakdowns, and there are times 100% where you are having maybe a thought process during your match and things like that. But during a good hard match or scramble, you're rarely thinking. You're just, your body's going. And sometimes I've watched some of these narrations where they'll like sort of imply they had some deep thought process going on. I'm like, maybe I'm just a knuckle dragger, but I'm like, most of the time we're just going,
Mm.
and our body's taking over, and then you're having these glimpses of thoughts happening on the fly, because if you have to sit there and have some deep thought process, you're going to be super slow in trying to execute things.
Yeah. I think one thing with black belt or experience in any kind of thing that you're doing, your body's better able to account for the variables. Like
Mhm.
it doesn't have to be ideally perfectly in one way for you to be able to adapt and still make it work for you. Maybe a reaction, they give you a different reaction. You're still able to use that to, create the technique that you need or move into the technique. I think you're able to adapt to a lot of variety more easily because your body's just more efficient and it
Mhm.
just knows kind of where things should be, where things shouldn't be. It's almost like you have a radar, a sensor on, like, oh, I expect this hand to be in this area. I know I'm going to grab it or go for it. It's like you're starting to think a few steps ahead. Not even think, but almost like your body starts to react in anticipation to their movement.
Well, the way that I think about it is, right, like, one, it's almost like a map where, as you train, especially when you start to develop a position that you're very good from, it's almost like you're fleshing out this map. You're learning all the side streets and detours and
Mhm.
everything else. So if one road's closed, you go this direction. Like this happened earlier today, right? I was coming down the road, and like the main road that goes to my home was closed. There's a car wreck or something. So I had to turn around and take a detour and go around a different way. Well, it's the same way with our techniques, right? You're going your main road that you'd like to go, but then there's a road closure. The guy blocks a grip. Well, what you find is people typically block things the same way multiple times, and then so you have to adapt to it. And so, like you said, as you get better and better, this whole process slows down a lot, where you can give it at least a little thought, and you can start to adapt to it and make the adjustments you need to. And again, going back to the idea of the slowing down, I think of it sometimes like a chess game where if I'm if I'm like a real experienced, very good black belt, and you're, let's say, like a white or blue belt, if you move one piece, I move like four, right? So it's not that I'm thinking ahead a little bit possibly, but it's simply you aren't moving in the sense that I am, right? Like I'm already moving steps ahead of you, because again, while your whole consciousness has to focus on grabbing the collar, I'm grabbing the collar, moving my foot in place, grabbing the sleeve, and all of this is happening without very much of an even conscious thought. And then I have a conscious thought about, I think I'm going to try to sweep him to this side, right? Or whatever, right? There's the conscious thought. But that's on, like, while you're still thinking about, I'm just grabbing the collar. I'm already thinking about the sweep. And so I think of it that way, where basically when you get into those situations, you're just, because time has slowed down and because your body's so automatic with this stuff, everything's just happening so fast, but yet for you it seems very slow. All right, guys. So hopefully you enjoyed the podcast. Hopefully you got something from it. Got an idea to chew on for your jiu-jitsu. Again, the idea is, again, we're white belt, just show up, blue belt, learn to play, purple belt, begin to dial in and specialize in a particular area. Brown belts, polish your game, make it a little bit more well-rounded so you don't have these huge, like, holes in your game that are easy to expose. And black belt, just forget all the rules. That's it, right? So again, just a couple ideas to chew on. Again, these are things that I thought would be useful for me at the different periods of time that I was in. And I thought that would be useful to a lot of people considering that. And so again, hopefully it's useful to you. Big thanks to our sponsors for helping make the podcast happen. Charlotte's Web CBD. You can check them out at charlottesweb.com. The promo code is Chewjitsu30, Chewjitsu30 for 30% off the order. I'll let you guys know how the CBN gummies go and how they help with sleep and everything else. And when I do, I'll let you know how that goes. But again, if you want to check out any of their products and save 30% off, whether it's the gummies, the tinctures, the balms that they have for sore muscles, check them out at charlottesweb.com with the promo code. Also, if you guys want to get any jiu-jitsu gear or apparel, check out epicrollbjj.com. In the near future, I will be getting some rash guards, some new jiu-jitsu rash guards made from Matt at Epic Roll. But for now, if you guys want to check out any of his stuff, he's got a lot of cool gear, designs for rash guards, t-shirts, gis, the whole deal. epicrollbjj.com is the website. Jiu-Jitsu20 for 20% off the order. If you want to support the podcast directly, you can do so by going to our Patreon at patreon.com/the Jiu-Jitsu podcast. When you join up and become a patron, you will get access to an exclusive library of content. You'll be able to send messages through there as well that'll get preferential treatment should you have a question for us or the podcast. And then on top of that, you'll then get an ad-free version of this podcast where if you don't want to listen to these ad reads, you don't have to do so. But if you want to get all that and more, check it out at patreon.com/the Jiu-Jitsu podcast. And last but not least, if you guys want to get my daily email, check it out at jujitsu.net/join. When you join up, you'll get a couple free gifts that I give away. You'll then get the daily email that I send out, which goes in. I mean, if you like the podcast and you like the rambling stuff, then you're going to like the email. The emails are generally short. They'll take you about 3 to 5 minutes max to read, if that. And again, the idea with those emails is to give you one little idea to chew on for your training or an idea off the mat as well. And then you can unsubscribe at any time. You'll also get exclusive offers that I don't put out anywhere else. Again, it's at jujitsu.net/join. So guys, with that said, thank you so much for being here with us today, listening to the podcast. Hopefully you enjoyed it. And I wanted to bring up one thing real quick. And it was from, here we go. It was from Dynamic Fisticuffs. He had a new rating for us on one of the podcast rating things. And he says, quote, "I want to chime in real fast and say I've had a vague idea of who Chewy was as a Wookiee-esque jiu-jitsu black belt coach with a beard. Hadn't actually watched any videos in years, but I was compelled to listen to the podcast as I was making progress on my own jiu-jitsu journey, but also having a training camp for an upcoming kickboxing fight. The sport I'm actually more competitive in." It's interesting. Listening to a jiu-jitsu podcast while you're in a kickboxing fight in camp. Mm-hmm. He says, spoiler alert for me, I did not win my fight, but around episode 15 to 21, that range, there's a lot of good positive and healthy mindset and training tips. That's the things that have been particularly helpful to do with competitions that I found them very helpful. Though it's in years in the past from when it aired, Chewy and Eugene and guests are definitely entertaining and having fun and have some helpful tips for training and competing. And I'm definitely becoming more of a fan and looking forward to hearing more episodes. Thank you and good luck on your own journey. Dynamic Fisticuffs, DF, appreciate you. Appreciate you, man. The comments. I wanted to give you a shout out. And again, if you guys want to support the podcast and any other different way than was listed earlier, then you can do so by checking us out on any of the podcast apps that you listen to. If they have a rating system, give us a good rating, leave a positive review, and it helps out. And guys, with that said, thank you so much for listening this week, and we'll talk to you next week.